Hello my friends. In this section we'll start looking at Identity and Access Management or IAM in AWS. AWS Identity and Access Management is a web service that helps you securely control access to AWS resources. You have different level of resources on AWS, for example S3 buckets, EC2 instances, and you need to have an access mechanism as well as an authentication mechanism, and that is a role which is provided by AWS. So you can use IAM to control who is authenticated, so users or groups or even AWS services, and authorize, that is, what level of permissions can be granted to these entities. These are the features of IAM. You have shared access to your AWS account. Shared access means that you can grant permissions to multiple people to administer as well as use your AWS resources. And this can also be achieved without sharing your password or sharing your access keys. The second feature you have is granular permissions. So you can grant different level of permissions to different people for different resources. And the permissions can be granular, that is, it can be up to a very minute, up to a very deep level. An example of this is that you have an S3 bucket and then you have several objects in this S3 bucket. So you can define if a specific user can access a specific S3 bucket rather than all the S3 buckets in your account, and if he can just read from that S3 bucket and not put objects into that S3 bucket. So you can define permissions up to that level. Secure access to AWS resources for applications that run on Amazon EC2. So there are two ways that you can allow your applications to access resources. One of them is you can give them the access key and the secret key. And the other way is that you can assign IAM roles to your EC2 instances. And this allows the applications to access the various AWS services that you have defined. We will look into this in depth when we start the Amazon EC2 part of our course. You have MFA, that is multi-factor authentication, which is enabled. So with multi-factor authentication, you not only enter the password, but you also have to enter a code from another device. This can be an application like a Google Authenticator or an Amazon Authenticator which is installed on your smartphone, or it can even be hard tokens issued by Amazon which you can configure. You have Identity Federation. So you may already have a corporate network. You may already have like Active Directory or LDAP which is running within your corporate environment, and you have users created in that environment. So with Identity Federation, instead of the user having to remember AWS credentials, you can define what a specific user who's already logged into AD or LDAP can do in your specific AWS account. You have identity information for assurance. So every task, every activity that you're doing gets logged into a service called CloudTrail, and you can go into CloudTrail. You can query CloudTrail and then find out what and when a specific action was performed. For example, a new user account was created. You want to find out who created that user account, who defined the policy. All that information can be gathered from CloudTrail. IAM is PCI DSS compliant up to level 1. PCI DSS stands for Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, and IAM is compliant up to level 1, which means that if you are hosting an application on AWS, which requires you to do financial transactions using credit card, then you are already compliant with IAM for this requirement. IAM is eventually consistent. What eventually consistent means is that once you create, for example, users or groups or roles or policies, or you change users or roles or policies, then the change will be replicated across IAM, but it is going to take some time. So it is eventually going to roll the changes across all services or across all the resources that you have. Finally, it is free to use. You are not charged for creating users, groups, authenticating, or even integrating with MFAs. You're not charged for any of these. IAM is absolutely free for you to use. Let's look at some IAM terms. So you have users, you have groups, you have roles, and then you have policies. So these are all the infrastructure elements that IAM has. And if you look at it, this is IAM for a specific AWS account. So if you see that an account ID is already defined over here. The principal over here means a user a federated user or role or an application. This is your principal. And then it is authenticating. And based on the authentication, after authentication, it is asking or requesting for some specific resources or for specific action to be performed on a resource. While this is happening, the authorization happens. The authorization is based on identity-based policies or resource-based policies. You can have policies defined at these two levels, or you can have different other policies that you can create. All the policies are defined in JSON. And then based on the authorization, you are able to perform specific actions either on the console or via the API or the CLI. For example, with the EC2 service, the actions that you perform is starting an instance, stopping an instance. With an S3, the actions that you can perform is like creating a bucket, listing the contents of a bucket, or deleting a bucket. And these actions in turn are performed on resources. So resources are, for example, an EC2 instance, a security group. It can be IAM itself, and it can be under S3, it is buckets and the objects which are there in a bucket. With IAM, you can also authenticate or have cross authentication. So you can have IAM users created over here who can then manage resources in other AWS accounts. And that's what is depicted over here with these diagrams. This is the official AWS IAM user guide link. I will put the user guide in the comment section also. You can go to this guide and you can get a whole lot of information about IAM, and you can do a deep dive into IAM and learn all the components. So it has got tutorials, it has got getting started, it has got troubleshooting. If you want to integrate with your Active Directory, or if you want to integrate your application to have authentication via Google or Facebook, all of that information is contained in the user guide.